She had nothing left. No home, no name, no reason to keep breathing. The berries sat in her palm like tiny black promises. Small, quiet, final. Mara Ellison had made her decision on a nameless road somewhere between Kansas and the end of everything she'd ever loved. The bankers had taken the house. The grief had taken her mind. And the frontier, vast, indifferent, brutal, had taken whatever was left. She raised her hand to her lips. That was the moment a stranger's voice cut through the silence like a blade. I wouldn't do that if I were you. The road didn't have a name. Most roads out this far didn't bother with names. They simply existed, cracked and pale as old bone, cutting through the tall grass and the scrubland like an old wound that never healed right. It was the kind of country that made a person feel small on a good day and invisible on a bad one. This was not a good day. Mara Ellison had been walking since before sunrise, though she couldn't have told you the exact hour she'd left the last town. A forgettable collection of warped buildings and suspicious eyes called Dunmore's Creek. She'd spent her last coin on a heel of bread 2 days ago. Before that, a widow's portion of cruelty from a man named Holloway at the First Territorial Bank, who had explained with something close to pleasure that the mortgage had been called in full, that the grace period had expired 3 weeks ago, and that he was terribly, terribly sorry for her loss. But business was business, and would she please not make a scene in the lobby? She had not made a scene. She had simply walked out into the white afternoon light and kept walking because there was nowhere to go back to anymore. Thomas was dead. The farm was gone. The life she had built with her own 2 hands, the ledgers she had kept with such precision, the kitchen garden she had planted row by careful row, all of it absorbed by the bank like water into dry earth, gone as though it had never existed. And so here she was, a woman of 34 with calloused hands and hollow eyes and a dress that had been decent once, walking a nameless road in the direction of nothing. She found the berries growing along a creek bed, just off the trail where a stand of cottonwood trees threw thin shade across the water. She recognized them immediately. Thomas had warned her about them years ago, back when they'd first come west and everything had still been possible. Devil's bead, he'd called them. Pretty little things. Don't let the children near them. They had never had children. She picked a handful. They were small and darkly purple, almost black in the flat morning light, and they sat in her palm with a terrible quietness. Her hand didn't shake. That surprised her. She had expected fear, or at least hesitation. Instead, she felt only a strange, exhausted calm, like a fever finally breaking. It's all right, she told herself. Nobody's waiting on you. Nobody even knows your name out here. She raised her hand. I wouldn't do that if I were you. The voice came from behind her, low and even, carrying no particular urgency, as though the man were commenting on the weather rather than interrupting a death. Mara went rigid. She had not heard anyone approach. She had heard nothing at all except the creak and the wind and the sound of her own breathing. She turned slowly. He was sitting on a gray horse at the edge of the cottonwoods, perhaps 20 feet away, watching her with dark eyes set in a weathered face. He was somewhere in his early 40s, lean in the way that comes from hard work rather than hard times, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days and a hat pulled low against the morning glare. His hands rested easy on the saddle horn. He did not reach for the rifle in the scabbard beside his knee. He simply looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Those are devil's bead, he said. You'll be sick for 6 hours before you die. It's not a pleasant way to go. Mara stared at him. Then I'll manage. I don't doubt it. He didn't flinch. You look like a woman who's managed a great deal. Something about the flatness of the observation. No horror, no melodrama, no rush to lecture her about the value of life, caught her off guard. She had expected pity. She had braced herself for it. Pity she could have withstood. What do you want? She said. I'm Silas Boone. He said it like that was an answer. I run the Double Rock Ranch, about 4 miles northeast of here. I've got 12 hands and a cookhouse that hasn't had a decent meal come out of it in 3 months. He tilted his head slightly. I need a cook. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the berries in her hand. You're offering me a job, she said. I'm offering you a reason to put those down. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed, but it's a start. She didn't move. The creek made its quiet sound behind her. Somewhere overhead, a hawk turned lazy circles against the pale sky, and she watched it for a moment because she did not know what else to do with her eyes. "I'm not a charity case," she said finally. "I won't be treated like one." "Good." He shifted in the saddle. "Because I don't run a charity. You'll earn every meal, every night's sleep, every cent I pay you. I'll expect breakfast before first light and supper on the table by sundown. I'll expect the cookhouse clean and the supplies accounted for. My men work hard. They eat hard. They won't be easy on you. I've managed difficult men before." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "Then we might get along fine." She looked at the berries one more time. Then she opened her hand and let them fall into the creek and watched the water carry them away. 4 miles northeast," she said. "Follow the road to the fork. Take the right branch. You'll see the water tower." He turned his horse and rode without waiting for her, which she found unexpectedly to be exactly right. She didn't want to be escorted. She didn't want to be watched over. She wanted to walk under her own power, at her own pace, making her own choice. She started walking. The Double Rock Ranch announced itself gradually, the way honest things tend to. First a fence line, then the water tower Silas had mentioned, then the dark shapes of outbuildings rising against the sky, and finally the main house itself, a 2-story structure of weathered pine that had clearly been built with more ambition than resources. It was not beautiful, but it was solid, and solidity, Mara had come to understand, was worth more than beauty in country like this. She heard the hands before she saw them. Voices, the clank of tools, the movement of horses, the ordinary noise of a working ranch in the morning. When she came through the gate, 3 men were crossing the yard. They stopped and looked at her with the particular brand of frank assessment that working men apply to anything unexpected appearing in their territory. The tallest of the 3, a raw-boned young man with red hair and a sunburned neck, looked her up and down without bothering to disguise it. "That the new cook?" he said, apparently to no one in particular. "Appears to be," said the man beside him, who was shorter and broader, with a beard that had gone past respectable into genuine wilderness. The red-haired one didn't sound impressed. "Last one lasted 11 days. "The one before that lasted 4, said the bearded man. 4.5, said the third man, who was older and quiet, and leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed, watching Mara with eyes that gave nothing away. I counted. Mara stopped in the middle of the yard and looked at all 3 of them with the steady gaze she had once used on suppliers who tried to short-wait her flower deliveries. "You going to keep talking about me," she said, "or are you going to tell me where the cookhouse is?" A short silence. The older man at the fence post uncrossed his arms. One corner of his mouth shifted upward. "Straight back," he said. "Past the barn. Can't miss it." She nodded and walked past all 3 of them without another word. She heard the red-haired one mutter something behind her back. She did not turn around. The cookhouse was a disaster. She stood in the doorway for a full minute, cataloging it. The stove had not been properly cleaned in. She didn't want to calculate how long. The grease had built up in layers like geological strata, each one representing a different era of neglect. The shelves were a confusion of unlabeled tins, some of which had clearly been opened and inexpertly resealed. Flour had been stored in a barrel without a proper lid, and something had gotten into it. She did not look too closely at what. A bucket in the corner held standing water of a color she chose not to identify. The single window was so thoroughly coated with grime that it admitted light only in theory. Mara stood in the doorway and breathed through her nose and took inventory. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to work. She found a store of firewood behind the cookhouse, dry enough to be useful. She found a second barrel of flour that had been properly sealed, buried behind the first. She found salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, a tin of lard, and, at the very back of the highest shelf, behind what appeared to be a year's worth of accumulated uselessness, a small, dusty jar of dried sage. She boiled water and scoured the stove until her arms ached. She scrubbed the shelving. She dragged the bad barrel outside and emptied it downwind of the building. She opened the window and propped it with a stick she found in the yard, and stood for a moment in the brief, shocking pleasure of clean air moving through a room. Then she started cooking. She had nothing fancy. She had beans and salt pork and cornmeal and whatever she could assemble from the limited stores around her. But Mara Ellison had grown up in a household where nothing was wasted and everything was made to stretch, and she had spent 15 years of marriage learning that a good meal was not about ingredients. It was about attention, about caring whether it was right. She got the beans soaking. She rendered the lard and started the cornbread in a cast-iron skillet she had scrubbed down to bright metal. She found wild onions growing along the fence line behind the cookhouse. She had spotted them on her way in. And she added them to the pot with the pork, and a pinch of the sage, and something that was not quite a prayer but was adjacent to one, the way concentration sometimes is. By the time the lunch bell should have been rung, she found the bell on a post by the door and rang it herself, because apparently no one else was going to. The cookhouse smelled like something worth eating. They came in with the usual noise and the usual lack of ceremony, 12 men in various states of dirt and sweat, dropping onto the benches along the long table with the collective sigh of people who have been working since before they were fully awake. Mara set the food on the table without announcement. Beans with the pork, the cornbread in the skillet still warm, a pot of coffee that was actually hot and actually strong, because weak coffee was, in her private taxonomy, one of the genuine small cruelties of frontier life. The eating began. Mara stood at the stove with her back to the room, washing the preparation dishes, and listened. The silence told her everything. Not a hostile silence. She had grown up around enough tables to know the difference. This was the silence of people paying attention to what they were eating, the silence of surprise. She heard the red-haired young man. She had learned his name was Cody from the snatches of conversation in the yard, say something low to the man beside him. She heard the bearded man, whose name appeared to be Dutch, respond with a sound that was approximately, huh. She heard the older man at the end of the table, whose name she didn't know yet, set his spoon down and then pick it up again. After a while, Cody said, loudly enough that she was clearly meant to hear it, "Beans are different." "Onions," said Dutch. "That all?" "And the sage." This was the older man whose voice was quieter than the others. "She found the sage." Another silence. "Pretty good," Cody said, which from his tone appeared to be a significant concession. Mara kept washing dishes and said nothing at all. Silas Boone ate in the cookhouse with his men, which she had not expected. Most ranchers of her acquaintance maintained a certain separateness from their labor, took their meals at a different table, at a different hour, to preserve the invisible hierarchy that kept things running. Silas sat at the end of the bench near the door, ate from the same pot as everyone else, and did not appear to find this remarkable. He ate efficiently and without visible pleasure or displeasure, the way a man eats when he's learned to treat food primarily as fuel. When he finished, he brought his bowl to the washing basin himself, which caused Cody to watch him with an expression of mild bewilderment. "It's good," Silas said, setting the bowl down. He said it the way he said everything, plainly, as a statement of fact rather than a compliment. "Better than it's been." "The supplies need organizing," Mara said. "I'll need a proper accounting of what's on hand before I can plan meals properly. And the flour barrel closest to the door needs to be thrown out and replaced. Something got into it." He looked at her. "Rats?" "Probably. You'll want to check for gaps in the floorboards." "I'll send someone." "Also, the window latch is broken. The stick I put in it will hold for now, but it won't hold all winter." Silas was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be recalibrating something, adjusting to the particular register of a woman who treated problems as things to be solved rather than lamented. "I'll see to it," he said. She nodded. That was all. He went back to the yard, and she went back to the business of making the cookhouse into something functional. But at the door he stopped and turned back, and for a moment he seemed to be working out how to say something that didn't have an easy shape. "That road where I found you," he said. "You don't have to tell me anything about it. I'm not asking." Mara's hands were still in the wash basin. She did not turn around. "Good," she said, "because I wasn't planning to." He left. She listened to his boots on the hard ground until they faded, and then she stood very still for a moment with her hands in the water and let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for several days. That night, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the last light had left the sky, Mara sat on the step outside the cookhouse with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands and looked at the dark shapes of the outbuildings and the fence lines and the vastness beyond, and tried to remember what it felt like to be a person who intended to keep living. It didn't feel like much yet, but it didn't feel like nothing either. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. Tomorrow she would inventory the stores properly. She would make a list of what was needed and present it to Silas in a form that could not be misread or misinterpreted. She would start building something here, not a life, not yet, maybe not ever, but at least a function, a purpose, something small enough to be real. She heard footsteps and looked up. The older man, the one with the quiet eyes who had told her where the cookhouse was crossing the yard toward the bunkhouse. He paused when he saw her on the step. "You're up late," he said. "So are you." He seemed to consider this fair. "Name's Holt," he said. "Ellis Holt. Been on this ranch 9 years." "Mara Ellison," he nodded. Then after a moment, "Cody was wrong about you lasting 11 days. She looked at him carefully. "What makes you say that?" Ellis Holt was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark horizon. "Cody never noticed the sage was there," he said. "You were here 6 hours and you found it." He turned and walked toward the bunkhouse. "Good night, Mrs. Ellison." "Good night," she said. She sat a while longer in the dark, turning the empty cup in her hands, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and was answered by silence. She did not notice that she had stopped thinking about the berries. The first sign came 3 days later. She would think about that afterward, how quickly it started, how ordinary the morning had been. She had risen before the hands and started the breakfast fire, and everything had been still and cold and exactly as it should be, the kind of morning that makes the frontier feel almost gentle. Then Cody came into the yard at a dead run, breathing hard, his red hair wild and his face drained of its usual color. "East fence," he said, to no one and everyone. "It's down. Something cut it." Silas came out of the house still buttoning his shirt. He and Ellis looked at each other with an expression Mara could not entirely read. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition. Like a man who hears a sound he's been dreading and has to acknowledge, finally, that it was always going to come. "How much of it?" Silas said. "Quarter mile, maybe more. 3 strands, all cut clean." "Cattle?" 30 head gone from the east pasture. Maybe more. The men began moving with the efficient urgency of people who know exactly what to do and would rather be doing it than standing still. Mara stood in the cookhouse doorway and watched, and felt the first cold touch of something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. She looked at the cut fence. She thought about the threatening tone she had noticed in 2 letters she'd found tucked carelessly behind the flour bin when she was reorganizing. She had assumed they were old, assumed they were personal, assumed they were none of her business. She was starting to wonder if she had been wrong on all 3 counts. She went back inside to see about breakfast because the men would need to eat before they rode, and that was her job, and she was going to do her job. But her mind was already working at something just below the surface of her awareness, turning the morning over like a stone to see what was underneath. 30 head of cattle, a quarter mile of fence cut clean, not the work of a drunk, not an accident, not bad luck. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone who knew exactly where to cut and when. Someone who had been watching this ranch long before Mara Ellison had ever walked through its gate. She cracked eggs into the skillet and listened to the sound of horses riding out into the morning, and thought very carefully about everything she had seen in the 3 days since she had arrived. By the time she had that first breakfast on the table, she already had more questions than the men who were riding out to look at the fence. And something told her, some instinct honed by 15 years of managing accounts and tracking discrepancies and noticing when numbers didn't add up, that the answers were going to be worse than anyone had yet imagined. The cattle didn't come back. Silas and 4 of his men rode the East Range until mid-afternoon, tracking the herd through trampled grass and broken brush, following a trail that eventually dissolved into the rocky creek bed where hooves left no print and the water told no stories. They came back at sundown with hard faces and empty hands, and the silence they carried into the cookhouse was a different kind of silence than the one Mara had learned to read over the past 3 days. This one had an edge to it. She put food on the table without comment. Venison stew she had stretched with dried beans and wild onion, biscuits that were better than anything the ranch had seen in months, coffee so strong it practically introduced itself. The men ate. Nobody talked much. When Silas set his bowl down and stared at nothing in particular at the far end of the table, nobody talked at all. It was Cody who finally broke it, because Cody, Mara had already come to understand, could not endure silence the way the older men could. Somebody drove them, he said. Had to. You don't move 30 head through creek water by accident. Nobody said it was an accident, Ellis Holt said quietly. Then who? Cody. Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The single word landed with the weight of a stone dropped in still water, and Cody went quiet and looked at his biscuit. Mara was at the stove with her back to the room. She was listening with the focused attention she had once applied to household accounts, the kind of listening that catches not just what is said, but what is carefully not said, the gaps and the hesitations and the words that get swallowed before they reach the air. She heard Silas push back from the table, heard his boots on the floor as he walked to the door and stopped. How many head do we lose, he said, to no one in particular, before we can't make the banknote? Another silence, this one longer. 40 more, Ellis said. Maybe 50, if the autumn prices hold. Silas made a sound that was not quite a word. Then he walked out, and the door swung shut behind him, and the men at the table looked at each other with the careful expressions of people calculating odds they don't like. Mara stirred the pot that didn't need stirring and thought about the letters she'd found behind the flour bin. She had read them twice, quickly, the morning after she found them, half convinced herself they were old business, personal matters, nothing that concerned her. They were written in a formal, cold hand on expensive paper, the kind of paper that announced its own importance. The first was dated 8 months ago. It had said in language that was technically polite and unmistakably threatening that the Double Rock Ranch sat on land of considerable mineral and water interest, that certain parties were prepared to offer a fair purchase price, and that it would be wise for Mr. Boone to consider his position carefully before the offer was withdrawn. The second letter, dated 6 weeks later, had dispensed with the politeness almost entirely. It said that the original offer had expired. It said that circumstances had a way of changing for the worse when men were not reasonable. It was not signed with a full name, only initials. RV. She had put them back where she found them, because they weren't hers to take. But she hadn't forgotten a word of either one. That night, after the men had gone and the cookhouse was clean and the fire was banked, Mara sat at the long table with a piece of paper and a pencil stub she had found in a drawer and wrote down everything she had noticed in the 4 days since her arrival. The missing cattle, the cut fence, the letters. The way Silas and Ellis had looked at each other when Cody reported the damage, not with surprise, but with something older than surprise, something that had been waiting. She wrote it all down in the neat, close columns that Thomas had always teased her about, the habit of a woman who'd managed a household's accounts through lean years and leaner years still. Then she looked at what she had written and sat very still for a while. She was still sitting there when she heard a step on the porch and the door opened and Silas came in. He stopped when he saw her. Thought you'd be in bed. I don't sleep much, she said, which was true, and not something she intended to elaborate on. He looked at the paper in front of her but didn't ask. He went to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she'd left warming, and stood with his back to the wall and drank it. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that he had stopped noticing the weight. But tonight the weight had shifted and he was feeling all of it at once. The letters behind the flour barrel, she said, from someone with the initials RV. I found them when I reorganized the shelves. I read them. I'm sorry for that. I wasn't looking for them. I just found them. He was quiet for a moment. And I think whoever cut your fence and drove off your cattle is connected to whoever wrote those letters. I think this has been going on longer than 4 days. I think you already know that. She paused. I think someone is trying to squeeze you off this land. Silas set the cup down on the shelf with a careful, controlled movement. He turned and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not quite readable, somewhere between wariness and something that might have been relief. The relief of a person who has been carrying a secret alone and has just realized they don't have to anymore. Randall Voss, he said. He's a land speculator out of Cheyenne, bought up 6 ranches in this valley in the past 2 years. Every single one of them went under after a run of bad luck that wasn't luck at all. He sat down across from her at the table. Cut fences, missing stock, a barn fire over at the Hendersons. Harlan Porter's well went dry the same week someone salted it. His wife found the empty bag. He looked at his hands. Nobody could prove a thing. Voss always had people between himself and the axe. Clean hands. But he sent you letters in his own initials. He sent me letters because he thought I'd fold like the others. He didn't think I'd still be here 8 months later. Something moved across his face, not pride exactly, more like stubbornness that has outlasted its own patience. He was miscalculating. Mara looked at her list. Is there a pattern to when it happens? The fence cutting, the cattle? Always when I'm low on men. Henderson was in town with half his crew when his barn went. Porter was running short-handed during calving season. He looked at her. How did you know to ask that? Because if it's organized, it's also planned. Someone is watching, waiting for the right moment. She tapped the paper. You should write down every incident, date, time, what was taken or damaged, how many men were on the property. If there's a pattern, it'll show. And if it ever comes to law, you'll need the record. Silas studied her across the table. It was a long, measuring look. Not impolite, but completely direct. The look of a man reassessing something he thought he already understood. You kept accounts, he said. Before. My husband and I ran a farm together for 15 years. I kept every record. She kept her voice even. I was good at it. I can see that. She folded the paper and set her pencil down. I'm your cook, Mr. Boone. What you do with what I've told you is your business. Silas, he said. What? You keep calling me Mr. Boone. My name's Silas. She looked at him for a moment. Silas, she said. Good night. She went to the small room at the back of the cookhouse, a narrow space with a cot and a window barely larger than a book, and lay down in her clothes and stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch settle into the night around her. She was not going to get involved. She was here to cook and to survive the immediate future and nothing more. She had told herself that very clearly. She almost believed it. The second incident came on a Thursday, 11 days after the fence was cut. Mara was at the cookhouse at first light when she smelled it. Not smoke from her own stove, but something different, heavier, wrong. She was outside before she had consciously decided to move. The fire was in the northwest corner of the hay barn, small but climbing fast, eating up the dry summer hay with an enthusiasm that made the air shimmer. She rang the bell. 4 sharp strokes, the emergency pattern Ellis had explained to her casually one afternoon. The kind of information he offered without fuss, as though he had already decided she was someone who ought to know useful things. Men came running from the bunkhouse in various states of undress. A bucket line formed in the time it might have taken someone else to think about forming one, and they fought the fire with the grim efficiency of people who understand exactly what burning hay means to a cattle operation going into autumn. They saved most of the barn, lost the northwest corner and roughly a third of the hay stored inside. Mara stood at the edge of the chaos and watched, and when the fire was out and the men were standing in the gray morning catching their breath and coughing ash out of their lungs, she walked around the outside of the barn slowly, looking at the ground. She found what she was looking for near the back wall. The grass was flattened in a path leading away from the barn toward the tree line. The flat, deliberate path of boots, not the scuffed, various prints of men running to fight a fire. Someone had stood at the base of the back wall, and she could see in the charred remains of the lowest boards the dark concentrated staining of something that had been poured there before the fire was set. Mara, Silas's voice behind her. Someone poured an accelerant here, she pointed without touching anything. See how the char is deeper on the bottom boards compared to how it spreads higher up. A hay fire moves upward. This one moved down first, then up. Something helped it start. Silas crouched beside her and looked. His jaw was tight. How do you know that? My father-in-law was a volunteer fire warden back in Illinois. He talked about arson like it was a personal offense. She straightened up. The person who set this came from the tree line. Probably left that way too. The ground's been dry enough that the boot prints have edges. She met his eyes. You should get Ellis to look at this before anyone walks through here. Ellis, when he came, looked at everything Mara had pointed out, and then looked at her with his quiet, weighing eyes. She's right, he said to Silas, about all of it. Cody was standing a few feet away, and there was something different in his face now. The easy contempt of those first days had been replaced by something more complicated. He looked at Mara the way a person looks at a stranger who has just done something unexpected and slightly unsettling, like he was revising a story he'd already told himself. 11 days, he said under his breath. She was fairly certain he wasn't talking to her. He was talking to some earlier version of himself that had made a very confident prediction. Nobody brought it up directly. They didn't need to. That evening, after supper, Mara asked Silas if she could look at the ranch's financial records. The question landed in the room like a dropped pan, loud, sudden, impossible to ignore. Silas looked at her. Across the table, Dutch paused mid-coffee and did not put the cup down. Ellis, who was the only man still in the cookhouse besides Silas, went very still. "The financial records," Silas said. "The accounts receivable, the cattle tallies, the note schedule with the bank, whatever you have." She kept her voice steady. "I'm not asking out of curiosity. I think there's information in those documents that might show something beyond what's visible in the physical incidents. If Voss is behind this, he may be working on multiple fronts at once. The cattle losses, the fire, those are pressure. But there may also be financial pressure from a direction you haven't looked at yet." Another silence. This one had a different texture than the others. Not hostility, but a man standing at the edge of something and deciding whether to step. "It's my ranch," Silas said finally. Not as a refusal, as a statement that he was still deciding what that meant. "It is," she agreed, "and I'm only the cook." He looked at her steadily. Something passed across his face that she couldn't name. Not quite trust, not yet, but the motion toward it. "Come to the house after the dishes are done," he said. "I'll show you what I have." The accounts were kept in a strong box under the desk in the small room Silas used as an office, a room as spare and functional as the man himself, with a single lamp and a window that looked out over the dark yard. He spread the documents on the desk and stood back while Mara sat down and went to work. It took her an hour. She worked in silence, in the focused, almost trance-like state that numbers produced in her, the world narrowing to columns and figures and the relationships between them. Silas sat in the chair across the room and didn't speak and didn't hover, which she appreciated. He had the rarer quality of knowing when to leave a person alone with their work. At the end of the hour, she set down her pencil and looked up. "Your mortgage note," she said. "The payment schedule." The first note was with Territorial Federal in Dunmore's Creek. Something in his voice shifted when he said the name of the bank. She noticed it. "I've been current on payments, never missed one." "Your note was transferred," she said, 6 months ago. Did you know that?" He went very still. "What?" She turned one of his documents toward him, a letter from the bank, buried 3 sheets deep under cattle tallies, which was where a man who spent his days on horseback and not at a desk might very reasonably have left it unread. "Territorial Federal transferred your mortgage to a holding company called Crestline Land and Cattle. The letter notifies you of the change and states that terms remain the same." She paused. "I've seen this kind of structure before. My husband's farm. Different names, same design. A legitimate bank sells a note to a private holding company. The holding company has more latitude than a regulated bank in how aggressively it can call the note due. Silas had come to stand beside the desk, reading the letter over her shoulder. She could feel the tension in him, the controlled, precise tension of a man who is very angry and is deciding what to do with it. "Crestline Land and Cattle," he said. "I'd want to know who owns that company," she said. "My guess is that the name at the end of that trail will be familiar to you." He straightened up. He looked at the document for another long moment, and then he looked at the wall, and his jaw was very tight, and he was quiet for long enough that the lamp had time to flicker twice in a draft from somewhere. "Voss?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I can't prove it from these documents alone, but the timing aligns. The note was transferred 2 months before the letters started. You need someone with legal access to look into Crestline's ownership, a lawyer or a federal man if it comes to that." She hesitated. "This is larger than one ranch, Silas. If he's done this to 6 other ranches in this valley, the documentation from each of them would build a picture that no single case could build alone." He turned and looked at her. The lamp threw long shadows across his face, and in that light he looked older and more tired than the man who had sat on a gray horse at the edge of the cottonwoods and offered her a reason to put down the berries. But he also looked, beneath the tiredness, like a man who has found solid ground under his feet when he was expecting to fall. "You said you were just the cook," he said. "I said I was only the cook," she corrected. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to his face, but she saw it start. "What would you do?" he said. "If this were your problem to solve." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the yard and something creaked, a gate or a shutter, the ordinary voice of a ranch at night. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the man at the bank in Dunmore's Creek who had watched her walk out the door with something close to satisfaction on his face. She thought about what it felt like to have your life taken from you by people who were never going to be held accountable, who had built systems specifically designed to make accountability impossible. "I would make them show their hand," she said. "Whoever is doing this is doing it from hiding. They let other men take the risk and take the blame. The only way to beat someone like that is to make them come out of hiding." She looked at him steadily. "But you'd have to be willing to use yourself as bait." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "That sounds dangerous." "Yes," she said, "it does." He nodded slowly. Something had shifted in the room. Some invisible threshold had been crossed. Some unspoken arrangement had been arrived at. She wasn't only the cook anymore, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so directly, which was exactly right. She gathered the documents back into their order and set them square on the desk. "I'll need to keep looking at these," she said, "if that's all right." "It's all right," he said. She left him there with the lamp and walked back across the dark yard to the cookhouse, and she sat for a long time on the step with the night around her, and the stars overhead were very bright and very cold, and she felt something in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. Not hope. She was too careful for hope yet. But something adjacent to it. Something that felt, after a very long time of feeling nothing at all, almost like intention. 3 days later, another fence line went down. This time it took with it a water gate on the South Creek, and by the time it was discovered, a section of the south pasture had been cut off from water for most of a day. 2 calves were in bad shape. The men worked through the evening getting them right. Mara watched Silas's face that evening at supper and saw something she recognized, the expression of a man who is approaching the edge of what he can absorb. Not breaking, not broken, but close enough to the edge that he could see over it. She refilled his coffee without being asked, and he looked up, and she held his gaze for just a moment. "We're close to something," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "They're increasing the pressure because they're close to what they want. That means we're still in the fight." He looked at her, then he looked at his coffee. "You sound very certain," he said. "I'm not certain of anything," she said, "but I know what pressure looks like when someone applies it, and I know that people who are winning don't usually increase pressure. They wait." She moved away with the coffee pot. "Someone is getting impatient. That's useful." She heard him exhale, a long, controlled breath, the kind a man takes when he is setting something down for just long enough to get through a meal. She went back to the stove and thought about the plan that was beginning to take shape in the back of her mind. It was not yet a plan, really. It was more like the outline of one, the scaffolding before the building. She could see the shape of it, but not yet all the details. It would require courage she wasn't sure she had. It would require trusting people she had only known 3 weeks. It would require her to step far outside the boundaries of what she had agreed to do when she had walked through that gate. But she was beginning to understand that the berries on the road had not been the only choice she'd made in the past 3 weeks. Every morning she rose before the others and built the fire and started the day. She was making a choice. Every meal she put on the table, every record she noted in her careful columns, every question she asked that helped move the truth one step closer to the surface. Those were choices too. She was beginning to understand that choosing to live was not a single decision made once. It was something you made over and over again, in small ways, every single day. The coffee pot was empty. She set it back on the stove and looked out the window at the dark yard. And somewhere across the ranch, a horse moved in its stall, and the fire in the stove ticked quietly, and Mara Ellison stood in the yellow light of a cookhouse she had claimed as her own, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, like a woman with something worth protecting. The plan came to Mara in the hour before dawn, the way most honest ideas do. Not as a sudden flash, but as something that had been assembling itself quietly in the back of her mind for days, and finally arrived complete enough to look at directly. She was at the stove, building the breakfast fire, when she set down the kindling and stood very still and let the whole shape of it come clear. It was audacious. It was dangerous in ways she could enumerate precisely, which was somehow worse than a danger that was vague. And it was, as far as she could determine after turning it over carefully from every angle, the only approach that had a genuine chance of working. She waited until after breakfast, until the men had ridden out and the cookhouse was quiet, and then she crossed the yard and knocked on the office door. Silas was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, and something in her expression made him set down his pen immediately. "Sit down," she said, which was slightly irregular given that it was his office. But he sat. She remained standing because she thought better on her feet, and she laid out the plan the way she had once laid out a season's accounts, methodically, without embellishment, every moving piece in its logical order. The core of it was simple. Someone was feeding Voss information about the ranch, the schedules, the crew numbers, the vulnerable points. Every attack had come at exactly the wrong moment for Double Rock, which meant someone was either watching very closely or receiving very specific intelligence from inside the valley. What Mara proposed was to use that pipeline against itself. They would let word travel, through casual conversation in town, through the ordinary social circuitry of a frontier community where information moved like water through cracks, that Silas was expecting a large payment. A land sale, she suggested. A story about a buyer from back east who was interested in the southern portion of the range and who was sending a bank courier through the isolated canyon road next Friday with a deposit of serious money. The story would be false in every particular, but it would be irresistible to someone already trying to bleed the ranch into submission. "You want to bait a trap," Silas said when she finished. "I want to give whoever is feeding Voss information something too good to sit on. They'll pass it up the line, and Voss, or whoever he sends, will move on it." She paused. "We'll be ready." Silas was quiet for a long moment. He had a habit, she had noticed, of going very still when he was thinking seriously. Not the stillness of a man with nothing to say, but the stillness of a man who understands that words, once released, don't come back. "There's a problem," he said. "Several," she agreed. "Which one are you thinking of? If we're wrong about the timing, or if they don't take the bait, we've wasted a week and shown our hand." He leaned back. "And if someone inside this valley is passing information, I need to know who, because I've trusted people in this community for years." "I know." She met his eyes. "That part is the hardest part." He was quiet again. Then, "Who would carry the story into town? It has to seem natural. If I go in talking about a land sale, it'll raise questions I can't answer without the story falling apart." "I'll do it," she said. He looked at her sharply. "No. I'm new here. I have no established patterns, no relationships that would make people question why I'm suddenly talking. A new cook who goes into town for supplies and happens to mention that her employer is expecting a significant payment, that's ordinary. That's gossip. It'll travel exactly the way gossip travels." She kept her voice even. "And if someone in town is Voss's contact, they won't recognize me as a threat. They'll see exactly what most people have seen since I arrived, a woman who cooks and doesn't matter." The edge in her voice when she said it was controlled, but Silas heard it. She saw him hear it. His jaw shifted slightly. "You matter," he said. He said it quietly, without elaboration, and moved on before she could respond to it. "What about the ambush? If they come for a courier on the canyon road, I'll need men positioned before they arrive. We'll be a day early at least, sitting in the rocks. Ellis can organize that. He knows the canyon country. And the courier? We can't send a real man alone into that road as a lure. We send a wagon with 2 men who look like one civilian and a driver. Dutch is broad enough to look like a banker's man if you put him in a decent coat. And we keep 2 more riders out of sight at the canyon's north end." She had been thinking about this for days, she realized. The details had been populating themselves without her conscious direction. The point isn't to let them complete the robbery. The point is to catch them in the act of attempting it, with witnesses, in a position where they can't run. "Men." Silas stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the yard was ordinary in the morning light. A dog sleeping against the barn wall. A hawk sitting the fence post. Everything still, everything apparently at peace. "If this goes wrong," he said, "people could get hurt." "Yes." "You could get hurt." "I'm aware." He turned from the window. "Why are you doing this, Mara? You came here to cook. You could keep your head down, collect your pay, walk away when this is over, one way or the other. This isn't your fight. She thought about the berries in her palm on a nameless road. She thought about Thomas and the farm and the man at the bank with his careful pity. She thought about the 6 ranching families Silas had named, families who had lost everything to a system designed to make theft look like business, to make crime look like bad luck. "I've seen what it looks like when people like Voss win," she said. "I've worn the result of it. I won't watch it happen to someone else if there's something I can do." She paused. "And I've had enough of being someone who doesn't matter." He looked at her for a long time, and then he nodded. "All right," he said. "We do it your way." She went to Dunmore's Creek 2 days later in the supply wagon with Cody driving, because Cody was young and voluble and his presence made the trip look like an ordinary household errand rather than anything deliberate. She bought flour and salt and 2 tins of coffee and a length of cotton fabric for patching, and she stood at the counter of the general store and let Mrs. Adler, who ran the store and was constitutionally unable to allow a silence to go unfilled, draw her into conversation. It didn't take long. Mrs. Adler was warm and relentlessly curious, and a new woman at the Double Rock Ranch was interesting by definition. "You settling in well enough?" Mrs. Adler asked, measuring out coffee with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 times. "Well enough," Mara said. "It's a busy place. Mr. Boone's expecting some business this week. A buyer from back east, I understand. Something about the South Range." She let her voice carry the casual, slightly bored tone of a hired woman overhearing things that don't entirely concern her. "There's talk of a significant transaction. I don't know the details. He keeps his business, his business." Mrs. Adler's hands slowed almost imperceptibly on the coffee scoop. "A buyer? Silas Boone selling land?" "I don't know that he is. There's a courier coming through Friday. I heard him mention to Ellis. Beyond that," she shrugged, "I just cook." She paid for her supplies and left, and on the drive back she sat beside Cody and said nothing at all about what she had done, and watched the road unroll ahead of them in the afternoon light. Cody, to his credit, had been told enough to hold his tongue. He was finding this difficult. She could see it in the set of his jaw, but he was managing. "You think it'll work?" he said finally, when they were back on the ranch road. "I think the right people heard it," she said. "And if they didn't? Then we try something else." He was quiet for a moment. Then, in a different voice, younger, less guarded, "I was wrong about you. When you first came, I thought—" "I know what you thought," she said. Not unkindly. "Yeah." He was quiet. "I'm sorry for it." "You watched it happen," she said. "Don't apologize for it. Just don't repeat it." He nodded, and she could see that he took it seriously, which was all she had asked of him. The next 4 days were the longest of Mara's time at the Double Rock Ranch. She cooked and she cleaned and she maintained every visible surface of her ordinary routine, because if there was someone in this valley watching the ranch, she would give them nothing to notice. Silas was equally controlled. She watched him at supper each evening, and he was the same as always, steady and spare with his words, giving no indication that anything was different about this week. But at night, after the cookhouse was closed, she could see the amber glow of the lamp in his office window until very late, and she knew he was going over the plans with Ellis, placing men, working through contingencies with the quiet thoroughness of someone who has learned to leave nothing to accident. On Wednesday night, she was cleaning the last of the supper dishes when the door opened and Ellis Holt came in. He poured himself a cup of coffee without asking, which meant they had arrived at the kind of familiarity where asking would have felt odd, and he stood against the far wall and drank it and looked at her with his usual measuring expression. "Men are positioned," he said. "North end of the canyon from First Light Friday. Dutch has a coat. He hates it. He'll survive the coat. Silas wants you to stay on the ranch Friday. He was very clear about it." Mara dried her hands on the dishcloth. "I heard him say so. He said he was very clear." "He was." She set the cloth down and looked at Ellis directly. "I'm not going to argue with him about it. I understand why he said it." Ellis nodded. He drank his coffee. He had a talent for comfortable silence that she respected. "Ellis," she said, "the person in the valley who passed the story along, do you have a guess?" He was quiet for long enough that she knew he did. "Cliff Marbury," he said finally. "He runs the feed store on the east end of Dunmore's Creek. He's been struggling financially for 2 years. A man in that position is vulnerable to a certain kind of offer." He paused. "I don't know. It's a guess." If we catch whoever comes Friday, and if they can be made to talk, Marbury's name may come up. I know. Something moved in Ellis's face. He had known Cliff Marbury for years, she realized. This was the particular grief of small communities. That betrayal, when it came, always wore a familiar face. I know, he said again, more quietly. She didn't say anything else about it. She refilled his cup, and they stood in the quiet cookhouse and let the fire do the talking. Friday arrived with a clear sky and a cold edge to the early air, the first real suggestion that autumn was closer than the calendar indicated. Mara rose at her usual hour and built her usual fire, and her hands were steady, and the coffee was strong, and she thought about the men sitting in the canyon rocks waiting for something that might or might not come. The morning was the longest she had spent since arriving. She scrubbed the shelves that didn't need scrubbing. She reorganized the spice tins into an order that was already logical. She started a pot of soup an hour earlier than necessary, and she stood at the window at intervals and looked at the empty yard and breathed carefully. She heard the horses come back at early afternoon, multiple horses, moving fast on the road to the ranch. She was out the door before they cleared the gate. Silas was in the lead, and she saw immediately from the way he sat the saddle that it had worked. There was a controlled intensity in his posture, a relief that was working hard to stay composed. Behind him, Dutch and two other hands rode in, and between them, tied to a saddle, was a man she had never seen. He was lean and weathered, and he had blood on his shirt sleeve and a look on his face like a man who has just watched his best options run out. Ellis came in last, and when he saw Mara in the yard, he gave one short, contained nod. They took the man, whose name, they would learn within the hour, was Cole Garrett, into the barn and sat him on a hay bale, and Silas stood over him with his arms crossed and the afternoon light coming through the slats in long, pale bars. Mara stood near the door. She had not been invited, but neither had she been told to leave, and no one moved to send her away. Garrett looked around at the assembled faces, Silas, Ellis, Dutch, Cody, two more hands, and Mara at the edge, and seemed to be running an internal calculation that kept returning unfavorable results. His shoulder had been bandaged with a strip of shirt, not serious, just enough to let him know that the men who'd surrounded him in that canyon had meant business. "You want to tell me who sent you?" Silas said. It was not a question. Garrett looked at the floor, then he looked up. "I want to know what happens to me if I do." "What happens to you if you don't," Ellis said quietly, "is that we hand you to the county sheriff on armed robbery charges. No statement from you, no cooperation, no reason for anyone to factor your situation into anything." He paused. "What happens if you do talk is that we're willing to tell the federal marshal's office that you provided material assistance." Garrett was quiet. His jaw worked slightly. "Voss doesn't leave loose ends," he said. "Voss isn't here," Silas said. "We are." Another silence. The barn smelled of horse and hay, and the distant smoke memory of the fire from 3 weeks ago, and Mara watched Garrett's face as the arithmetic of his situation completed itself. "His name is Randall Voss," Garrett said. "He operates out of a land office in Cheyenne under 3 different holding company names. Crestline is one, Harmon Pacific Lands is another." He exhaled. "He's been running this play across 4 counties, buy up distressed notes, apply pressure on the properties, wait for them to fold, acquire at collapse price. He's got a man in every major town along this valley, men who feed him information about which ranches are vulnerable and when." "Cliff Marbury," Ellis said. Garrett looked at him. "Among others." "How many ranches?" Mara asked. She had not spoken until now, and Garrett looked at her with mild surprise, as though he was only now registering her presence. "How many families has he done this to?" Garrett thought about it. 14 that I know of. Probably more I don't. 14 families. 14 versions of what had been done to Thomas's farm, to her farm, multiplied across this valley, and carried out with patient, organized cruelty. The number settled on Mara's chest like a stone. "He has a ledger," Garrett said. He was talking faster now, with the particular velocity of a man who has decided to fall and wants to fall completely. "A private record of every transaction, every property, every payment made to the men who worked for him. He keeps it because he doesn't trust anyone, and he wants insurance against them. He's kept it for years." He looked at Silas. "If you can get that ledger to a federal marshal, Voss is finished. All of it ends." Silas looked at Ellis. Ellis looked at Mara. She was already thinking. The The ledger was in Cheyenne, which meant this was not over. Not nearly. A confession from a hired hand was useful but not sufficient. Voss would deny it, discredit Garrett, find legal protection in the layers of holding companies and paper transactions he had constructed so carefully. For it to end completely, for all 14 families and whoever came after them, the ledger had to be found.
"Where does he keep it?" she said. "His land office on Meridian Street," Garrett said. "Back room, behind a panel in the east wall. It's not locked. He thinks nobody knows it's there." "Does anyone else know it's there?" "His right-hand man, a lawyer named Pruitt. And now me." He paused. "And now you."
Silas was looking at Mara, and she could see him working through the same series of implications she was already several steps into. The canyon ambush had been the visible part of what she had proposed, the part she had described to him in the office 3 weeks ago. But there was a second part she had not described, because she had not fully formed it yet. She was forming it now. Getting to the ledger would require going to Cheyenne. It would require someone Voss didn't know, who could move without attracting attention. It would require timing and exactness, and the capacity to appear completely ordinary in a situation that was anything but. She knew, before Silas said anything, what he was going to say. And she knew, before she said anything in response, what her answer was going to be. Some decisions, she had learned, were not made in a single moment. They were made over weeks of smaller choices, each one building on the last, until the final decision was not a leap, but a single last step in a direction you had already been walking for a long time. She had been walking toward this since the berries fell into the creek. Silas said exactly what she knew he would say. No. He said it before she had spoken a single word of what she was thinking, because he had read it in her face the same way she had learned to read his, through the accumulated vocabulary of weeks lived in close proximity to someone, the grammar of small gestures and held silences. "Whatever you're about to propose, no." "You don't know what I'm about to propose." "You're about to propose going to Cheyenne." She looked at him steadily. "Someone has to." "I'll go. Voss knows your face. He's been having this ranch watched for months, which means he's been having you watched. You walk into that land office on Meridian Street, and the ledger disappears before you get through the door, and Garrett's confession is all we have, which is not enough." She kept her voice level and precise. "I'm a stranger, a widow passing through Cheyenne, looking for work or family or whatever story fits the moment. I can walk in and out of that building without anyone looking twice." They were standing in the yard outside the barn, the late afternoon turning the sky above the ridge a deep and serious orange. Garrett had been locked in the tack room with Dutch outside the door. The other men had dispersed to their work with the discreet tact of people who understand that some conversations require space. Ellis had not dispersed. He stood a few feet away, leaning on the fence, listening without pretending otherwise. "She's right," he said. Silas looked at him with an expression that suggested Ellis's agreement was not currently welcome. "She is," Ellis said again, unapologetically. "We send you, we lose the ledger. We lose the ledger, Voss walks. He finds new holding company names, moves his operation 60 miles north, and starts again on a new set of families." He pushed off the fence. "I don't like it either, but she's right." Silas was quiet. He looked at Mara with an expression she had learned to recognize. The particular set of his jaw when he was fighting a conclusion his own intelligence had already reached. She waited. She had learned, too, not to push him in these moments. He arrived at things on his own terms, or not at all. 2 days there, 1 day to find the ledger, 2 days back, he said finally. 5 days total. 4 if the roads are clear. You'll take Cody on the wagon as far as the junction. He turns back from there. I won't leave the ranch shorter-handed than I have to. He looked at her with an intensity that was difficult to meet without flinching, though she managed it. If anything feels wrong when you get there, if the land office is being watched, if anything looks like a trap, you leave. You don't try to be clever. You don't improvise. You leave and you come back and we find another way. All right. I mean it, Mara. I know you mean it, she said. I said, all right. Another silence. A long one, with the orange sky going deeper behind him and a wind coming down off the ridge that smelled of pine and the first cold edge of the season turning. "You should eat something before you go," he said, which was, she understood, the closest he was going to come to saying what he actually meant. "I'll eat in the morning," she said. "I plan to leave before it's full light." She turned and went back to the cookhouse, and she stood inside it for a moment in the gathering dark, looking at the stove she had scrubbed, the shelves she had organized, the window propped open with its stick, the small claimed territory of a person who had decided to stay. She packed a travel bag that night with the practical economy of a woman who had once moved across half a continent with 2 trunks and a sick husband and a season's worth of uncertainty. Clean dress, extra stockings, the small amount of money Silas had paid her so far wrapped in a handkerchief, her pencil stub and a folded paper. The ivory-handled penknife Thomas had given her their first winter west, which she had carried every day since his death, and which she was not entirely sure she carried for protection, and not simply because it was the last thing of his she had. She slept 4 hours. She woke before the alarm of her own intention and lay in the dark for a moment, listening to the ranch breathe around her, the horses, the wind, the particular silence of people asleep after hard work. Then she rose and dressed and went to the stove. Silas was in the kitchen when she got the fire going. She had not heard him come in. He was sitting at the end of the long table with his hat on and his hands around a cup he'd clearly already poured, which meant he had been awake before her. She didn't comment on it. She started the coffee. "I've written down the address Ellis has for the land office," he said. He slid a folded paper across the table. "And the name of a man in Cheyenne, a retired federal deputy named Augustine Bray. He's honest. He's been trying to build a case against Voss for 2 years, but hasn't had anything solid enough. If you can get the ledger, you take it directly to Bray. Don't carry it back across open country. Get it to Bray and let him secure it." He paused. "His address is on the same paper." She picked up the paper and tucked it into her pocket without opening it. "You've been planning for this possibility. I've been hoping it wouldn't come to this. Planning and hoping are different things." She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and sat down across the table with the other. The fire was beginning to warm the room. Outside the window, the sky was still absolutely dark, the last proper dark before the early gray of pre-dawn. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "Before all of this started, what it was like." He looked at her, faintly surprised by the question. "Why?" "Because I'd like to know what we're fighting to get back to." Something shifted in his face. He looked at the cup in his hands. "My father built the main house," he said. "He and my mother and my older brother, the summer of 1861, when half the country was occupied with other things. They broke ground on the south pasture with a team of borrowed mules and a great deal of borrowed optimism." A pause. "My brother died of fever the following winter. My father never entirely recovered from it, but the ranch did, somehow." He turned the cup slightly. "My mother kept the accounts. She had a head for numbers the way some people have a head for music, naturally, without effort. She could look at a column of figures and see the pattern in them the way other people see shapes in clouds." He looked up. "You remind me of her sometimes." Mara held his gaze. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It's meant as one." She drank her coffee, and he drank his, and the fire ticked warmly in the stove, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with anything further. There was a particular quality to that silence, different from the working silences of the cookhouse, different from the careful silences of the early weeks. This one was simply 2 people sitting together at an early hour with something serious ahead of them, and finding that the other's presence made the serious thing more bearable. Cody had the wagon ready at first light, as instructed, wearing an expression of concentrated seriousness that sat somewhat awkwardly on his habitually easy face. He had clearly decided that this was an operation requiring gravity and was working to supply it. Ellis shook Mara's hand at the gate, a formal, equal gesture that she returned with equal formality and felt more than she showed. Silas walked beside the wagon to the road. He put his hand briefly on the rail near where she sat, not quite touching her hand, not quite not. 4 days, he said. 4 days, she agreed. He stepped back. Cody clicked his tongue at the horses and the wagon moved, and Mara did not look back, because she had learned long ago that looking back at things you're leaving makes the leaving harder and does nothing for the thing you're going toward. Cheyenne arrived at the end of the second day, larger and louder than Dunmore's Creek, in the way that a river is larger and louder than a creek. The same elements, multiplied to a scale that changed their character entirely. Mara checked into a modest boarding house on a side street, gave a name that was not entirely false. Ellison was her name. She simply omitted the Mara, and ate a meal in the common room that reminded her, with a small pang, of how far her cookhouse skills exceeded the standard of most frontier establishments. She spent the first evening simply walking. She found Meridian Street, located the land office from across the street without approaching it, and stood at the window of a dry goods store pretending to examine bolts of fabric while she observed the building and the people moving around it with the patient attention she had once used on ledgers and supply lists. The office was a two-story wooden building, prosperous-looking but not ostentatious, the building of a man who wanted to project solidity rather than wealth. A brass plate on the door read, Crestline Land and Cattle, Regional Office. Two windows flanked the door on the ground floor. A young man sat at a desk visible through the left window, copying documents in the last of the afternoon light. As Mara watched, a second man came out the front door, heavy-set, well-dressed, moving with the precise self-importance of a lawyer, and turned north on the street without looking around. Pruitt, she thought. Garrett had named Voss's lawyer. This had to be him. She noted the hour. She walked back to the boarding house and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and thought carefully about what she had seen and what she needed to do tomorrow. The following morning, she dressed in her better dress and pinned her hair with the care of a woman presenting herself for respectable business, and she walked to Meridian Street and pushed open the door of the Crestline Land Office at 20 minutes past 9. The young man at the desk looked up. He was perhaps 22, with the slightly startled expression of someone interrupted mid-thought. "Good morning, ma'am. Can I help you?" "I hope so." She arranged her face into the mild, slightly worried expression of a widow dealing with a property matter she doesn't entirely understand. It was not a difficult expression to arrange. She had worn it often enough in the year after Thomas died. "My name is Clara Ellison. I have some questions about a parcel of land I may have inherited from my late husband. I understand your office handles land acquisitions in the Eastern Valley region." It took 11 minutes. She was genuinely impressed in retrospect at how well she managed the 11 minutes, asking questions that were complicated enough to require the young man to retrieve documents from the file room down the short hallway, which left her twice alone at the front desk for 45 seconds to a minute each time. The first time she used to locate the door at the end of the hallway. The second time, when she heard the young man's footsteps retreating down the hall, she moved quickly and quietly through that door. The back room was used for storage and private meetings. A table, 4 chairs, a cabinet, and on the east wall, the wood-paneled surface that Garrett had described. She found the panel by pressure rather than sight, running her fingers along the edges until she felt the slight give, and it swung open on a simple pivot to reveal a shallow alcove with a single shelf. The ledger was there. Thick, cloth-bound dark green, its spine unmarked. She took it, put it under her arm inside her coat, pressed the panel closed, and walked back into the main office and resumed her position in front of the desk. 3 seconds before the young man returned with the document she had sent him for. She spent another 4 minutes asking questions she already knew the answers to, thanked him with genuine warmth that was entirely disconnected from the thumping of her heart, and walked out into the morning air of Meridian Street. She walked 2 blocks before she allowed herself to breathe properly. Augustine Bray lived above a gunsmith shop on a quiet street 6 blocks from the land office. She found the door and knocked, and after a long moment it was opened by a man in his late 50s with white hair and a careful face and the eyes of someone who has spent decades looking at things most people prefer not to see. She said, "My name is Mara Ellison. I've come from the Double Rock Ranch in the Eastern Valley. Silas Boone sent me. I have something that belongs to you." She held out the ledger. Bray looked at it. He looked at her. Then he opened the door fully and stepped back. "You better come in," he said. She sat across from him at his kitchen table while he read, and she watched his face as he turned the pages. The tightening around his eyes, the slight forward movement of his body as he leaned closer to the records, the single long exhale he released somewhere around the 30th page that was not quite a word, but contained the weight of 2 years of frustrated effort. He looked up at her when he finished. "Where is Cole Garrett now?" "At the Double Rock Ranch, locked in the tack room with a man outside the door." "Is he willing to testify?" "He said he was, in exchange for consideration." "He'll get it."
Bray closed the ledger carefully, with a reverence that struck her as appropriate. Mrs. Ellison, this is more than I expected. This names every transaction, every intermediary, every bribed official. His voice was controlled and even, but underneath it she could hear something that had been compressed for a long time beginning to expand. Do you understand what this means for the families who lost their land? She looked at him across the table. I have some idea, she said quietly. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, as though accepting something. I'll have federal warrants issued before the end of the week. I'll need Boone's formal statement and Garrett's testimony, and I'll need you to stay in Cheyenne for 2 days while I get the initial paperwork. 1 day, she said. I need to get back. He looked at her. Something passed across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. 1 day, then, he said. She was back at the Double Rock Ranch on the evening of the 4th day, which was what she had promised. She came up the road in the last good light of the afternoon and saw Silas standing at the gate before she had cleared the final rise, standing there as though he had simply decided to be in that particular place at that particular time, which she understood meant he had been watching the road. He did not move toward her as the wagon came in, just stood at the gate with his hands at his sides and watched her come. When she stepped down from the wagon, he looked at her face and then at the absence of the ledger. She had left it with Bray, as instructed, and understood immediately from both that it had gone the way it needed to go. Bray has it, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Are you all right? Yes. She meant it. She was tired in every layer of herself, but underneath the tiredness, something had come loose that had been fixed in place for a very long time. Yes, I'm fine. He reached out and took the travel bag from her hand, not pulling it away from her, just taking the weight of it, which was a different thing. It was such a simple gesture that she almost didn't register it. But she did register it, and she let him take it, and they walked through the gate together. The warrants came 12 days later. She heard about it from Ellis, who had ridden into Dunmore's Creek for supplies and returned with news that moved through the valley faster than weather. Federal marshals out of Cheyenne had arrested Randall Voss at his land office on Meridian Street on a Tuesday morning. His lawyer, Pruitt, had been taken the same hour at his home. Cliff Marbury had surrendered voluntarily at the county sheriff's office. Ellis reported this quietly, without elaboration, and she did not press him for how it made him feel. The young man who had worked the front desk, it emerged, had known nothing. She had been right about that. That evening at supper, the cookhouse was louder than she had ever heard it. A different quality of noise than the ordinary daily volume, lighter, relieved, with the particular brightness of men who have been living under sustained pressure that has suddenly, finally, been removed. Dutch laughed twice in 10 minutes, which Cody appeared to find remarkable. Ellis permitted himself a third cup of coffee, which for Ellis was practically celebratory. Mara moved around this table, refilling cups and listening to the noise and feeling it pass through her, the way warmth passes through cold hands. Gradually, from the outside in, finding layers that had been cold for a long time. After the men had gone and the dishes were done, she sat at the long table with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. The old habit, the step, the dark yard. But inside tonight, because the evening had turned cold with the full arrival of autumn, and she thought about 14 families. She thought about what it would mean for them when Bray's case was completed, when the ledger entries were matched to deeds and transactions, when the federal courts unwound the machinery that Voss had used to take what wasn't his. Some would get land back. Some would get money. Some would get only the knowledge that the man responsible had been held to account, which was not enough but was something, and something was not nothing. She had learned this past month the particular value of something that is not nothing. Silas came in from the yard and stopped when he saw her still at the table. He had not expected her to be there, but he didn't say anything about it. Just went to the stove and poured the last of the coffee and came and sat across from her. And they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet together, comfortably, without cost. The banknote, she said after a while. Crestline. Bray says it reverts to the original terms with Territorial Federal. Voss's acquisition of the note was fraudulent. It's part of what the ledger documents. He wrapped both hands around his cup. The ranch is clear. She nodded. Something inside her released that she had not entirely realized was still held.
Mara. He said her name the way he said other important things, plainly, as its own complete sentence, without decorating it. What are you going to do now? She thought about the question. She had been thinking about it, in the background of everything else, for days. She thought about the road where he had found her. She thought about the berries in the creek, carried away by water, gone to wherever water takes things. She thought about Thomas, whose memory she had been carrying like a wound for so long that she had forgotten it was also a love story, and that love stories don't end. They simply change in character. She looked across the table at Silas Boone, who had offered her a job when he could have offered her pity, who had trusted her with his accounts and his plans and his ranch, who stood at gates watching roads in the late afternoon because he was not a man who said things directly when the gesture could carry more weight than the words. I think, she said carefully, that depends on what you're asking. He looked at her. I'm asking you to stay. I'm already staying. I'm the cook. I'm asking you to stay as something other than the cook. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the first wind of the season moved across the yard with purpose. She could hear the horses in the barn and the distant sound of someone in the bunkhouse. Cody, probably. He was always the last one settled. And the whole ordinary music of a working ranch at the end of a long day. I'm not the same woman I was, she said. Not a warning, not an apology. A true thing, stated plainly, because he deserved plain truth. Whoever I was before all of this, I'm not going back to her. I don't want to. I know that, he said. I'm not asking for her. She held his gaze across the table and felt the truth of that settle into her. Felt it move through the cold layers, the grief layers, the layers that had been convinced for a very long time that there was no warmth left to find. Then yes, she said, I'll stay. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. The word yes hung in the air of the cookhouse long after Mara had said it, settling into the room the way wood smoke settles into wool, quietly, permanently, changing the character of everything it touches without announcing itself. Silas did not reach across the table. He did not make any gesture that might have felt like claiming something. He simply looked at her with those dark, weathered eyes and nodded once, the way he acknowledged all true and important things, without excess, without theater, with the full weight of his attention. Then he finished his coffee and said goodnight and walked across the dark yard to the house. And Mara sat alone in the cookhouse for a while longer and listened to the fire and felt the particular quality of a life that has just quietly turned a corner. She did not sleep much that night, but it was a different kind of wakeful, not the hollow, grinding sleeplessness of grief, but something closer to the alertness of a person standing at the beginning of something unfamiliar, trying to take its full measure before stepping forward. She was still at the stove before first light the next morning. Some things, she had decided, did not need to change. The trial of Randall Voss began on a cold morning in early November, in the federal courthouse in Cheyenne, and the valley watched it the way people watch weather, with a mixture of dread and hope and the knowledge that whatever came down from that sky was going to affect everyone equally, regardless of whether they deserved it. Mara did not attend the opening proceedings. She had given her formal deposition to Augustine Bray in the days following her return from Cheyenne, a careful document that described in precise detail what she had observed in the land office, how she had located and retrieved the ledger, and the full sequence of events at the Double Rock Ranch from the cut fences to the canyon ambush. Bray had read it twice, asked 4 questions of clarification, and told her it was the most organized witness statement he had received in 22 years of federal work. She had thanked him and come home. Silas attended the first week of proceedings with Ellis, riding the 2-day journey to Cheyenne and back with the grim purposefulness of men who understand that justice, like hard labor, requires showing up in person. He came back the first time with the subdued energy of someone who has seen a thing they needed to see. Voss in a federal courtroom, the ledger entered into evidence, the machinery of genuine accountability finally engaged.
Yes.
He looked smaller than I expected, Silas said, the evening of his return, sitting at the cookhouse table while Mara set supper before him. Men like that, you build them up in your mind. You fight them for so long they start to feel like something larger than a man. And in the courtroom? Gray suit, thin hair. He kept looking at his lawyer instead of the judge. He paused. Like a man who has spent so long having other people take his risks for him that he doesn't know how to face one directly.
Mara thought about the letters on expensive paper, the careful initials, the layers of holding companies designed to keep clean hands at the center of dirty work. He never expected to be in that room, she said. Everything he built was designed to make that room impossible.
Until it wasn't. Until it wasn't, she agreed. Cole Garrett testified on the third day. His statement, corroborated by the ledger entries, identified 17 separate acts of arson, theft, sabotage, and intimidation carried out on Voss's behalf across 6 ranches over a period of 4 years. The number had grown from what he'd told them in the barn. Additional details surfaced as Bray cross-referenced the ledger against incident reports gathered from other counties. Each entry in that cloth-bound green book was a family. Each column of figures represented someone's life, reduced to the arithmetic of acquisition. The ledger, Bray wrote to Mara in a brief letter that arrived the second week of November, was the most comprehensive record of organized land fraud he had encountered in his career. Voss's compulsion to document everything, born of distrust, of the need to hold leverage over his own operatives, had become the instrument of his destruction. Justice, she thought when she read that letter, sometimes has a dark sense of irony. Voss was convicted on all primary counts in the third week of November. His sentence was delivered on a Wednesday morning, 15 years in federal prison, the maximum the law permitted for the aggregate charges. Pruitt, his lawyer, received 7 years as a co-conspirator. The holding companies were dissolved by court order, their assets liquidated and directed into a restitution fund administered by the federal court. The restitution process was slow and imperfect, as such processes always are. Some families received land back. Others, whose properties had already been resold to innocent third parties, received financial settlements that were real but inadequate. Real money cannot fully compensate for the specific piece of earth where someone built their first home, planted their first garden, buried their first grief. Mara understood this with her whole body, not just her mind. She did not pretend that the outcome was perfect. She only knew that it was better than what had come before, and that better was worth fighting for, and that sometimes better was all the world offered. The Double Rock Ranch entered its winter season with the calm of a place that has been through something difficult and come out the other side still standing. The cattle numbers were recovering. Silas had located 22 of the original missing head, sold to a stock dealer in the next county by Garrett's outfit, and the court had ordered their return as part of the restitution order. The hay barn's northwest corner was rebuilt before the first snow, Dutch swinging a hammer with an enthusiasm that suggested he found carpentry more satisfying than wearing a banker's coat, though he never said so directly. Cody, in the weeks after the arrest, had ridden over to 3 neighboring ranches and told them what had happened and how it had been resolved. He had done this without being asked, on his own time, on his own horse, and he had come back each time with the expression of a young man discovering the particular satisfaction that comes from doing something useful for reasons that have nothing to do with personal benefit. Mara watched this happen and said nothing about it, because some things grew better in silence. Ellis Holt had gone to see Cliff Marbury once, at the county sheriff's office, in the days before Marbury's sentencing hearing. He had gone alone and said nothing about the visit when he returned. Mara did not ask. 2 weeks later, she found a small package on the cookhouse step, wrapped in brown paper, containing a jar of preserved plums and no note. She set it on the shelf and said nothing, and Ellis looked at it once and said nothing either. And in that particular silence, they both understood everything that needed to be understood. Marbury received a suspended sentence in exchange for his full cooperation with federal authorities. He closed the feed store and left Dunmore's Creek before winter. Where he went, no one in the valley knew or said. On a Saturday morning in early December, 3 weeks after the conviction, a wagon came up the road to Double Rock Ranch that Mara did not recognize. She was in the cookhouse yard splitting kindling. She had taken this task over from the rotating roster of hands, partly because she found the rhythm of it satisfying, and partly because she was constitutionally unable to wait for other people to do things she was perfectly capable of doing herself. She set down the axe and watched the wagon come. There were 2 people in it, a man and a woman, both older, both worn in the way of people who have been worn by hard specific circumstances rather than by the ordinary passage of time. The woman had her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at the house with an expression that Mara recognized immediately and viscerally, the expression of someone arriving at a place they had built their courage to reach. Silas came out of the house and stood on the porch. The man got down from the wagon slowly, with the careful movement of someone whose joints had been arguing with them for years. He took off his hat. "Silas Boone," he said. His voice was rough. "Harlan Porter," Silas said. He came down the porch steps and crossed the yard and put his hand out, and the older man took it, and they stood there shaking hands for a moment longer than a formal greeting requires, both of them looking at something just past the other's shoulder. The woman, who was Harlan Porter's wife Ruth, sat in the wagon and looked at Mara. Her eyes were the clear, direct gray of someone who has cried most of what she had to cry and arrived at something harder and quieter on the other side of it. "You're the one who went to Cheyenne," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Mara said. Ruth Porter looked at her for a long moment. "Harlan's brother still has a place 30 miles east," she said. "He took us in when we lost ours. We've been there 2 years." She paused. "The settlement money came last week. It's not enough to rebuild where we were, but it's enough to start again somewhere else." Another pause. "I wanted to look at the woman who did it. I needed to see her with my own eyes." Mara stood in the cold December yard with the axe handle in her hand and held the older woman's gaze and felt the weight of what was being offered. Not thanks exactly, though thanks was part of it. More than that. Recognition. The acknowledgement from someone who understood the specific cost of what had been lost and what had been retrieved, of the fact that it had been worth the retrieving. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." The Porters stayed 2 hours. They sat at the long cookhouse table and drank coffee and ate the ginger cake Mara had made the previous day. And Harlan Porter told the story of their last years. The salted well, the threats, the slow financial strangulation that had driven them off land his father had homesteaded. He told it steadily, without self-pity, the way strong people tell hard stories. Ruth Porter added details when he missed them and held her coffee cup in both hands, and looked around the cookhouse with the eyes of a woman cataloging a thing that functions correctly, taking comfort in the evidence of order. When they left, Silas walked them to the wagon. Mara stood in the doorway and watched Ruth Porter look back at her from the wagon seat, and the older woman raised one hand, a gesture that was not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement, the kind of thing people do when words have reached their limit. Mara raised her hand in return. She went back inside and finished washing the coffee cups and stood at the window for a while, looking out at the empty yard and the gate and the road beyond it, and she thought about the other families. 13 more, at minimum, beyond the Porters. She did not know all their names. She knew that some of them were rebuilding, and some were still deciding whether rebuilding was possible, and some had been broken in ways that restitution could not reach. She held that knowledge without flinching from it, because it was true. And true things required looking at directly, and then she put it in the place where she kept the things she could not fix. A real place. In her. A place that had grown larger with the years. And she turned back to the stove, because the ranch hands would want lunch and the bread needed another 20 minutes, and the world continued requiring its ordinary tending. December deepened. The first proper snow came on a Thursday and covered the ranch in a silence that was different from the summer silences. Heavier, more complete, as though the land itself had taken a breath and was holding it. Mara stood on the cookhouse step in the early morning and watched it fall and felt something she had not expected to feel in winter. She felt at home, not the home of before, the farm in Illinois, the life with Thomas. That home was gone, and she had stopped expecting to find it again. This was something new, a home that fit the person she had become rather than the person she had been. It was smaller in some ways and larger in others, and it was entirely, irreducibly, hers. 2 weeks before Christmas, Silas asked her to walk with him in the evening. This was unusual. Not the walking, they sometimes walked the fence line together in the late afternoon if the work allowed, but the asking, the formality of it, the slight difference in his manner that she noticed and filed and waited on. They walked south, where the land rose gently toward the ridge and the pine trees began. The snow lay clean and undisturbed in the last light of the afternoon, and the sky above the ridge was the clear, deep blue of winter evenings in high country, and their breath made small clouds that the cold air took. He was quiet for a while. She did not push it. "My mother's ring is in the house," he said finally, "in the strongbox where I keep the ranch papers." He kept his eyes on the ridge. "It's a plain thing, just a gold band." She wore it 40 years. Mara walked beside him and did not say anything and waited.
I've been thinking about what you said, that you're not the same woman you were. He paused. I've been thinking about what I am now compared to what I was, before the letters started, before the trouble, before you came up the road. He turned and looked at her, and in the fading light his face was very clear, all the habitual reserve stripped away by the cold and the privacy of the ridge and the particular courage of a man saying a true thing out loud.
I don't want to offer you something that belongs to who we were before. I want to offer you something that belongs to now, to what we've become. Mara stopped walking. He stopped beside her. You're asking me, she said. I'm asking you. The pine trees stood dark and still against the blue sky, and the snow lay quiet all around them, and somewhere down the ridge a horse made its barn sound, and the smoke from the cookhouse chimney rose straight and pale in the windless air. She thought about Thomas, let herself think about him fully, without flinching, without the old cramping guilt of the living who go on living. He had been a good man. He had loved her well and been loved well in return, and the 15 years of their life together had been real and complete in themselves, not a prelude to anything and not diminished by what came after. She did not need to set him down to take a step forward. She only needed to understand that carrying him and moving forward were not opposites. She had known this, she realized, for some time. She had simply been waiting for the moment when the knowing became solid enough to stand on. Yes, she said, the same word as before, at the cookhouse table, but different in weight now, different in the full scope of what it accepted and what it offered. Silas reached into his coat and took out the ring and held it in his gloved palm. It was as he had described it, plain gold, worn smooth by 40 years on another woman's hand, carrying the weight of long faithfulness in its unpretentious surface. She took off her glove, and he placed it on her finger, and they stood on the ridge in the winter light, and did not make speeches about it, which was exactly right, because the ring said everything a speech would have fumbled. They walked back down to the ranch in the last of the light, their footprints making a double trail in the snow, and Mara felt the cold band on her finger, and felt the familiar rise of the cookhouse chimney smoke, and felt, underneath everything, the steady and sustaining truth that she was here, that she had chosen to be here, that the choosing had been made not in a single moment of rescue on a nameless road, but in 10,000 smaller moments since, every morning fire, every meal, every record kept and every question asked and every step taken toward a truth that other people were hoping would never be found. The men at supper that night noticed the ring immediately, because men who work closely with people develop an attention to detail that the work requires, and because some things are not subtle. Dutch noticed first. She saw him see it when she set down the bread basket, and his broad face did something complicated and ultimately settled into an expression of complete and unguarded warmth that surprised her, because she had not expected warmth from Dutch specifically, which perhaps said something about the limits of her own perceptions. Cody, when he noticed, went red from his collar to his hairline and looked at Silas and then at Mara and then at his food and said, in a voice that was working very hard to be casual, "Well, about time." Ellis Holt looked at her hand and then at her face and then at Silas, and he nodded with the slow, deliberate satisfaction of a man who has been waiting a reasonable amount of time for something reasonable to happen and is pleased to see the world occasionally cooperating with his expectations. "Congratulations," he said. He meant it in the full, unadorned sense of the word, and everyone at the table knew it. Mara served the rest of the meal and drank her coffee and listened to the noise of the table around her and felt it move through her, warm and specific and real, and thought of nothing particularly profound. She thought about whether the bread had risen correctly, and whether the coffee was strong enough, and whether the fire needed another log, and she thought about the ring on her finger and the snow on the ridge, and the porters in their wagon driving away to start again somewhere. And she thought about a nameless road and berries falling into a creek and water carrying them away. She thought about what it meant to still be here. Spring came to the Double Rock Ranch with the extravagant generosity that follows a hard winter. Grass growing thick in the south pasture, the creek running full and clear, the cattle moving across the recovered range with the unhurried contentment of animals on good land. The hay barn stood complete and solid, its new lumber still pale against the weathered gray of the older buildings. The cookhouse window no longer needed its stick. Silas had fixed the latch in February. On a cold afternoon when the work outside was impossible, and he had apparently decided to address every deferred repair in the house and its outbuildings simultaneously, which had resulted in 2 days of focused, methodical activity that Mara had watched with considerable appreciation. The south pasture fence was new. The water gate was new. The herd was larger than it had been before the trouble, augmented by a careful purchase in early spring that Mara had advised on, studying the cattle market reports with the same focused attention she brought to any column of figures. The ranch's financial position, once she had fully reorganized the accounts, proved stronger than Silas had realized. He had been, by his own admission, better at running cattle than at reading his own ledgers, and a year of Mara's management had clarified the picture considerably. On an afternoon in late April, a letter arrived from Augustine Bray. The final restitution payments had been distributed. The last of Voss's holding companies had been formally dissolved. The land office on Meridian Street now housed a legitimate surveying firm. The case was, in the formal language of the federal court, closed. Mara read the letter at the cookhouse table and then folded it carefully and set it with the other papers she kept in the small wooden box that had once held Thomas's penknife and now held the accumulation of the past year. Bray's letters, the original list she had written in pencil on the first night she'd sat up thinking about cut fences and threatening notes, the deposition she had given in Cheyenne, and the receipt for the flowers she had bought at Mrs. Adler's General Store on the morning she had planted the story that had brought the whole structure down. She kept these things not as trophies, she kept them as a record. The habit of a woman who understood that what is not recorded is eventually disputed, and that truth, to remain true, sometimes needs a witness. She took the letter to Silas in the afternoon. He read it standing in the yard, and when he was done he folded it and looked out at the pasture for a moment, at the cattle and the new fence and the creek glinting in the spring light. "It's over," he said. "It's over," she agreed. He handed the letter back to her and she put it in her pocket, and they stood together in the warm afternoon and watched the ranch be what it was. A working place, a living place, a piece of land that had been fought for and kept and was being tended with the daily, unspectacular faithfulness that is the actual texture of a life built to last. In June, 2 neighboring ranchers brought their families to the Double Rock for the first time since the trouble. The Aldersons from the North Range and the Crew family from the Creek Valley, people who had drawn away during the bad months and were now finding their way back toward the ordinary commerce of neighboring. They came on a Sunday and sat at long tables set up in the yard and ate a meal that Mara had been planning for 3 days. And there was noise and children and the particular happiness of people who have been isolated by fear and are no longer afraid. Ruth Porter sent a letter from the town where she and Harlan had begun again, 60 miles to the east. It said only that they had taken a lease on 20 acres of good ground, that the soil was different from what they'd known, and that different wasn't necessarily worse. It said that she thought of the cookhouse often. It said that she hoped Mara was well. Mara wrote back. She told Ruth about the spring, the recovered herd, the Sunday gathering in the yard. She told her that the sage was growing again along the cookhouse fence line, and that she had found it the first morning she arrived and had never stopped using it. She told her that the valley was quieter now, which was a different thing from peaceful, but that different wasn't necessarily worse. She sealed the letter and set it with the outgoing post, and went back to the cookhouse, and stood in the doorway for a moment in the June light. The stove was warm, the shelves were orderly. The window was open on its repaired latch, and through it came the smell of grass and cattle, and the faint sweetness of the wild onions she had found growing along the fence on her very first day, which she had kept growing deliberately since, because they were useful, and because they were the first thing on this ranch she had recognized and named. Silas came across the yard and stopped at the cookhouse door and looked at her in the doorway. He did this sometimes, arrived in the middle of the afternoon on some thin pretext or no pretext at all, simply to find where she was. She had come to understand this not as oversight, but as a version of care that his particular character expressed through presence rather than declaration. "Ellis wants to talk to you about the autumn supply order," he said. "Tell Ellis I'll be there in 10 minutes. He didn't move. "Silas!" "I'm going," he said. He didn't go. She looked at him in the doorway with the warm cookhouse behind her and the warm afternoon in front of her, and she felt the ring on her finger and the ground under her feet and the deep, specific steadiness of a woman who knows exactly where she is. "Go tell Ellis 10 minutes,"
she said, more gently.
He went. She watched him cross the yard, that unhurried, purposeful walk, the particular set of his shoulders, the way he moved through the space of the ranch as though the land and he had arrived at a mutual understanding, and she felt something that she no longer hesitated to name. She had been cautious with the word for a long time, because the word was large and she had been burned down to a very small thing when she arrived here, and large words require a certain solidity of ground before they can be trusted. The ground was solid now. She stepped back into the cookhouse and took her apron from the hook and put it on and went to the stove, and the ranch moved around her in its ordinary rhythms, and somewhere on the south pasture the cattle grazed in the afternoon sun, and the creek ran clear and cold over clean stones, and the road to the north, the nameless road where a woman had once stood with berries in her palm and no reason left to put them down, lay quiet in the summer distance, just a road, belonging to no particular story. Hers was here. She was still writing it, and for the first time in longer than she could measure, that was exactly enough.